In the late spring of 1874, Coal Creek simmered beneath a pitiless sun. The air thick with dust that coated every surface like a second skin. The heat was relentless, stripping pain from church doors and wringing judgment from every squinting eye. At the heart of town, a rough-hewn wooden platform rose not for justice, but for humiliation. There stood a girl, scarcely 18, gaunt and grim with a newborn in her arms. Her name was Betty Coburn, chained, dirt-smeared, and accused of poisoning her elderly husband just days after his death. Rumors swirled like vultures in the heat, that she'd killed Jed Colburn and paraded his bastard son as a prize. Voices in the crowd spat venom, branding the baby cursed and his mother a stain that would doom any home she entered. Betty said nothing. Her dress was torn, blood dried in a crust along her brow, and yet she bowed her head not in shame, but in silent defiance, knowing that if she dared show pride, they'd crush that too. The baby whimpered, his cries muted by confusion and fear, and when a tomato smashed against her back, she shielded him instinctively, jaw tight, eyes dry. The sheriff called it a mercy auction, a practice the town had convinced itself was more humane than a noose. Someone could buy her freedom, provided they took the baby too. $2. Someone sneered from the crowd, laughter thick with cruelty. Then a voice, calm and commanding, sliced through the jeers. That's enough. Heads turned as a lone man stepped forward. Dusty boots, worn coat, a revolver resting at his hip, and a silver watch chain catching the sun. Gabriel Pike. He was a stranger, but no one knew him well. 36, a former Union scout who returned from war with a limp, a small fortune, and no taste for heroism. He ran his ranch alone, and had never brought a woman under his roof. Until now. "I'll take her," he said, voice steady. The sheriff blinked, uncertain. "You sure, Mr. Pike?" "Not charity," Gabriel replied, tossing a pouch heavy with coin. "For the bond, and enough to shut every damn mouth in this town." The crowd murmured, but no one challenged him. The chains fell away with a metallic clatter. Betty didn't speak. Her knees buckled slightly, but she held firm, cradling her son close as she stepped down. Gabriel approached slowly, eyes calm, cautious, not pitying, but deliberate, like a man who'd seen worse and knew when not to speak. "Can you walk?" he asked. She nodded. He didn't offer his hand, just gestured the wagon. She climbed aboard without looking back. As the horses pulled away, someone called out, "Bet you won't last a week with her, Pike." Gabriel said nothing. The wagon creaked over the dirt road, the crowd's hateful whispers fading into the wind. Betty sat stiff beside her son, who had gone quiet, his tiny chest rising with shallow, hitching breaths as if the crowd's fear still echoed in his bones. She rocked him gently, eyes fixed on the horizon. Gabriel kept his eyes forward, reins in hand, hat low as the wind tugged at its brim. When the child shivered, Gabriel reached back without a word and passed her his coat. "You'll both freeze," he muttered. She hesitated, then wrapped her around the baby, its scent of leather and pine smoke both foreign and oddly grounding. She didn't thank him, didn't know how. They rode in silence until the prairie thinned into groves of cedar and pine, and a creek curved into view. Nestled near its bend stood a weathered ranch house, broad, gray, flanked by a barn, a tool shed, and 3 indifferent horses grazing in the dusk. The house looked like it had once held a family, and hadn't seen one in years. Gabriel halted the wagon, climbed down, and gestured to the porch. "This is it." Betty stepped down, her legs stiff with fear. He opened the door and nodded inside. "You'll take the room to the right. There's a stove, a water basin, supper's on the table." She hovered at the threshold, uncertain if she should remove her shoes, ask to enter, or even speak. He seemed to sense her hesitation. "It's your roof now, too," he said simply. Inside, the house was plain but clean, with floors, thick curtains, a single oil lamp flickering like a heartbeat in the gloom. Inside the house, Gabriel guided her toward a small side room just off the hallway. It was modest, but clean and prepared, more than she'd known in months. A narrow bed stood in one corner. Beside it a simple washstand, a folded blanket, and, to her surprise, on the night table sat a bowl of steaming soup, a bottle of warm milk for Jonah, and a single square of fabric neatly folded. Gabriel lingered only a moment, his voice dry and quiet. "Happy 1 month, little one," he said, before turning and leaving her there in silence. Betty didn't move at first. Her breath caught. In all the weeks of fear and whispered scorn, no one, not one soul, had acknowledged that her baby's life was worth marking. Her hands trembled as she reached the spoon, but Jonah whimpered before she could take a bite, his hunger rising in soft, urgent cries. She fed him first, cradling him close, while tears gathered silently and slid down her cheeks. The room was warm, too warm. Kindness, when given after cruelty, felt like a burn. Her stomach twisted at the scent of soup, unready for comfort, but she managed a few bites before settling Jonah into the folded blanket. She sat beside him, listening. The house wasn't entirely quiet. Somewhere down the hallway, in a room far removed from hers, a gentle sound drifted through the stillness. Fingers on strings, hesitant and imperfect, but soothing. A guitar. Gabriel Pike, alone in his corner of the house, playing not for an audience, but to fill the quiet with something soft. Betty closed her eyes. The melody wasn't what struck her. It was the silence between the notes. She'd heard that before. 3 years ago, at the autumn fair in Red Bluff, she'd handed a man his fallen scarf. A simple moment, a shared glance. It had been him. These were the same eyes. On the table beside the soup bowl lay a handkerchief, old, worn, faintly embroidered, initials faded by time. The same one. She touched it gently, fingers uncertain, and brought it to her lips. No tears came. She had none left. Instead, she lay beside her son, listening to the quiet song in the distance. It wasn't meant for her, but it wasn't hidden either. Outside, the trees whispered. Inside, for the first time in a month, Betty slept without dreaming of chains. Mornings in this part of the land came slowly, light stretching lazily over the pine ridges. Betty woke before the sun, her movements careful and quiet, like smoke drifting through the halls. Her days unfolded in a rhythm of hushed routines. Feeding Jonah, washing clothes, sweeping dust from corners I hadn't known touch in years. She avoided Gabriel's eyes, not out of distrust, but habit. Men's eyes had taught her too many lessons, none of them safe. Yet Gabriel's gaze was different. Brief, calm, never lingering, never wanting. That frightened her more than hunger ever had. He never asked, never imposed, and in that distance, she found something she had not expected. Safety. Each morning, firewood appeared stacked beside the stove. Water was drawn from the well. A towel left folded on the washstand. He said nothing of it, and she never asked, but she noticed. One afternoon, while scrubbing the kitchen table, Betty caught herself humming to Jonah, the windows open to a breeze that smelled of earth and pine. It stunned her. She hadn't looked over her shoulder once. That terrified her too. But memories come like shadows, creeping even through light. It had been less than 2 years since she stood at an altar in borrowed white, 17 and numb, handed to Jed Colburn like livestock. He was twice her age, his voice brittle as dry rope, his hands always cold, always smelling of rust and smoke. He had never struck her, not in the way others whispered about, but he had never touched her gently either. She had lived in silence, eating cold meals, confined to rooms where her voice had no place. He treated her as one might treat a fine knife, possessed but never cherished. And then Jonah came, born amid blood and pain, but wrapped in warmth that belonged only to her. That child was hers in a way no man could steal. She held him now as if clinging to life itself. Gabriel, meanwhile, kept his distance. He worked the land with quiet diligence, mending fences, tending horses, sitting on the porch in the evening with a ledger and a glass of water collected from rain. But sometimes in the evenings, he would sit near the fire while she rocked Jonah, silent, watchful, sipping coffee and waiting, not prying, just present. And then one night, his voice broke the quiet, soft and low like the wind beyond the walls. "I was in Montana once," he said. "Winter campaign, cavalry job. Snow so deep you lost. The men before the bullets," he said quietly, staring into the fire, his jaw clenched as if holding back more than words. Betty looked up, startled by the weight in his voice. "We lost 11 in 3 days, not a gunfire, just cold and hunger." I brought 2 back, both blind from frostbite. The rest, his voice faltered, the silence that followed more telling than anything he could have said. She waited, unsure whether to comfort or simply listen. That was the last time I wore a uniform, he finished, then stood and walked away, retreating to his room. She sat long after, Jonah sleeping softly in her lap, the fire dwindling to glowing embers. That single story, quiet and unfinished, was the first piece of himself he had offered her, and she held it like something delicate and rare. But even kindness could not fend off the body's breaking point. 3 nights later, illness struck without warning. Sweat glazed her skin. Her limbs shook, and just after laying Jonah in his cradle, her knees gave out and the floor rose to meet her. Darkness swallowed her before she could call for help. When she opened her eyes again, the sun was shining through the window, casting golden rays through the curtain. Her body ached, her head throbbed, but she was warm, tucked beneath blankets, the faint smell of broth lingering in the air. Jonah slept peacefully in a chair beside the bed, swaddled and untouched by fear. And in the far corner sat Gabriel, his coat draped over the chair, boots off, hat tilted over his face, a damp claw still in his resting hand. He had stayed, sat there with her through the night. He had not stripped her, not touched her except to tend and guard and watch. Just protected, just stayed. She blinked back something sharp and unfamiliar. Not pain, not fear, but the shock of safety, of being seen and not used. For the first time in so long, the ache in her chest was not dread. It was disbelief, and something softer she refused to name. Summer deepened its hold on the land, days lengthening like shadows across the earth. But within the walls of the ranch, time passed gently. Betty found herself slipping into a rhythm without even noticing. She rose early to feed Jonah, swept the porch, then followed Gabriel into the garden with quiet steps. He never gave orders, never demanded anything of her, but she took up the work anyway, grateful for the unspoken understanding between them. He showed her how to trim the squash vines, when to pluck mint leaves before they turned bitter, and how to identify raccoon nests buried along the fence line. They moved like 2 spirits from different wars. Her battle marked by betrayal and survival is by memories of men lost in snow. One morning, he led her to the sheep pen and handed her a bag of feed. "Crouch low," he murmured. "Let them come to you. Don't rush. They spook easy." Betty obeyed, crouching slowly, her hand outstretched. A lamb approached, bleated gently, then pressed its head to her knee. She smiled, small, quick, almost accidental, then pulled away, rising too fast like the warmth that caught her off guard. Later that week, Gabriel placed a revolver in her hand. Figure a woman ought to know how to protect what's hers. She stared at it, uncertain, then closed her fingers around the grip. It was cold, solid, an object and a promise all at once. He taught her how to fire behind the barn, how to breathe slow and steady, how to trust her own hand. She never missed. Still, something inside her remained barricaded. But Jonah laughed more now. He gurgled when Gabriel entered the room, and once reached the man's beard with a tiny fist. Gabriel had only chuckled and said, "You've got a grip like your mother." The compliment struck her harder than she expected. That night, as the sun melted into the forest beyond the field, they sat on the porch. The hush between them was broken only by crickets and firewood settling in the hearth. Then Gabriel spoke. "You two can stay for good, if you want." Betty didn't look at him. "I'm not the kind of woman you need," she said, voice barely above a whisper. He let the silence stretch before she filled it with more. "I've been claimed, branded, thrown away. Everything left in me is what the fire didn't take." Gabriel leaned forward, elbows on his knees, staring out at the horizon. "I don't need you to be anything," he said, "except alive." Then he stood, nodded once, and went inside. Betty stayed, heart thudding with something unnamed, her chest tight from words she hadn't expected and didn't know what to do with. Later that night, after Jonah had fallen asleep and the wind hummed low through the grass, she stepped outside. Gabriel had been splitting wood most of the day and now sat slumped on the porch bench, boots off, head tipped back, eyes closed. Sleep had found him before his bed had. in the moonlight. His face looked both older and strangely young, less burdened, stripped of the careful hardness he wore by day. He looked like a man who belonged to no one, and for a moment she wanted to be someone who could belong to him. She hesitated, then crossed the porch with quiet steps, a blanket folded in her arms. Gently, she draped it over him, her fingers brushing his shoulder, lingering near his cheekbone. And then, slowly, carefully, her hand moved closer, hovering in that space between caution and something she hadn't dared feel in a long, long time. She touched him just once, a quiet press of skin against skin. Not a plea, not a promise, just a question too fragile for words. Gabriel didn't stir. Betty let her hand fall, standing there for a breath that felt longer than it was, studying the man who had given her nothing but space and safety, then turned and stepped quietly back inside. She closed the door behind her without a sound, and for the first time since the nightmare began, allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, her hands could hold something without breaking it. The peace that settled on the ranch was gentle but uneasy, the kind of stillness, that whisper of ends not yet come. Gabriel Pike recognized that hush. He'd heard it before, in the war, moments before ambushes, when the birds stopped singing. Now, it echoed again each time he watched Betty hum to her son, while sweeping the porch or brushing Jonah's soft hair from his forehead with tenderness that never asked permission. One cloudy morning, Gabriel saddled his horse. "Need to pick up a few things," he told her. Betty nodded, unaware that he was riding far beyond Coal Creek. By late afternoon, he arrived in Black Hollow, tying his horse outside a crooked cavern thick, with drying herbs and bones like relics. Dr. Elmer Pritchard squinted through smudged lenses. "Gabriel Pike thought you vanished east." "Not quite," Gabriel said. "I need to ask you about a corpse, Jed Colburn." The doctor's face tightened. "That old snake?" "Yeah, I saw him." Skin tone was off. Veins blackened, looked like poison. But nobody asked what kind. Gabriel waited. Bearcat mushroom. Namgo. Slow, bitter, almost undetectable. The Colburns used to keep it for Jed's pain bruise. Who had access to it? The doctor scratched his chin. Anyone working the grounds. But Jed was sloppy. I wouldn't put past the wrong man. Gabriel already had a name. Clive Remsen. Former stable hand. Fired after a public blowout with Jed. He'd cooked on occasion, cleaned when forced, and always watched the world like it owed him. Now he was back in town, speaking Betty's name like she was some helpless cause. Gabriel left the doctor and rode hard for the old Coburn estate. The house stood shuttered, barn locked tight, silence heavy as accusation. Behind the house, he found the herb shed. Dust coated everything. He scanned the shelves, jar after jar labeled in Betty's careful hand, until one, tucked far back, caught his eye. The jar wasn't labeled like the others. Inside, the stench confirmed it. Bearcat. As he resealed it, a torn paper beneath the shelf caught his attention. A supply log, Clive's name scrawled beside the requisition date. Gabriel pocketed the jar on the page, then turned his horse for home, pushing the animal hard across the prairie. The sun was dipping low when he reached the ranch, his shirt soaked with sweat, a thorn cut bleeding on his hand. Betty stood on the porch, Jonah nestled in her arms. She didn't speak, just watched. He dismounted, handed her the reins, and moved toward the wash basin. "Wait," she said softly. She stepped forward and took his wrist, unwrapping the cloth with gentle fingers. She cleaned the wound with water and salve, the tin from beside the door. Her touch didn't falter. She didn't ask where he'd gone. Gabriel watched her, silent. For the first time in days, their eyes met, and she didn't look away. The grief in her gaze had softened into something steadier. Cautious, yes, but laced with trust. "I'm not used to people coming back," she murmured. Gabriel answered without hesitation. "I don't leave people." She nodded, finished the bandage, and stepped back inside. Gabriel stayed a while longer, her scent still lingering in the air, the weight of the jar and paper pressing against his ribs. Justice would not come from the courts or the crooked men who held gavels. It would come from hands like his, weathered, patient, and unflinching. Days later, as the horizon bled gold into the hills, two horses appeared on the ridge. Betty was hanging laundry, a damp sheet in her grasp. When she saw them, she froze, fingers clenched, heart slamming. One rider wore a gray coat, crisp and polished. The other rode with a swagger she hadn't seen in years. Clive Remsen, unmistakable in posture and pride. He rode like the land owed him something. The man beside him, clean-shaven and professional, carried a leather satchel and the practiced air of a man who only appeared when things were about to be taken. A lawyer, unfamiliar, not from Cold Creek. Gabriel met them at the gate, opening it without a word and motioning them toward the house. The air inside cooled despite the summer heat, thick with tension. Clive removed his hat with a smoothness that didn't match the hunger in his eyes. "Good evening," he said, voice slick with false charm. "Gabriel. Miss Coburn." Betty stood near the hearth. Jonah pressed close against her shoulder. She said nothing. Gabriel leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. Clive cleared his throat, then retrieved a sealed document from the lawyer's satchel. The man stepped forward, placing it on the table like it was something sacred. "This," Clive began, "is the last will and testament of Jed Colburn, recently discovered in a lockbox under his study floorboards, complete with notary seal and family crest." Gabriel raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. Clive offered a tight, calculated smile. In it, Jed expressed concerns about Miss Coburn's stability, her temperament, the unfortunate scandal surrounding the boy's birth. Betty's jaw clenched, but she did not speak. She did not flinch.